GameSci.com. GameSci.com.
Welcome to the Twilight Zone, where we learn PHP and JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It started with JavaScript, but was soon extended to PHP, C++, Python, Ruby, Java, etc. It was invented on JavaScript, so that's what's in the title, but it's used on many different languages. It is a language or platform independent data exchange format between the client and the server. It is a direct competitor to XML, but JSON now dominates. XML is the old way we used to send data from the client to the server and back. JSON is the new way to send data from the client to the server and back. Data is exchanged as text or strings between the client and server. JSON makes it easy to send and receive JSON format strings. It's easy to convert a JSON string to or from an object in PHP. When done processing the data, it is returned as HTML or as a JSON string to the browser. Similar to how we process CGI form data with $_get and $post. But JSON is language independent. $post is very PHP specific. But JSON format strings are understood by just about every programming language, including PHP and JavaScript. PHP and JSON. The JSON string format started with JavaScript, where you could create an object by assigning it a string literal. PHP and other languages found it was simple to write functions to convert that string format to and from their own objects. All you need to know is how to turn a JSON string into a PHP object and vice versa, how to turn a PHP object into a JSON string. We are not going to cover JavaScript, but you need to understand that it's the client that creates the JSON format string and sends it to the PHP program on the server, which converts the string to a PHP object, processes that data, and returns HTML or a JSON format string back to the client for display. So the JSON originates on the client or the browser. It sends a JSON format string to a server, which processes it and then sends back HTML or another JSON string. $JSON string equals, and this rather elaborate string, that's the JSON format string I've been talking about. We will assign a JSON format string to a PHP variable. It is easier to study the format if we can see the string. Keep in mind, the string is usually sent from a client or read from a file or database. It's not hard-coded like I've shown it here. Recall from CGI form data, the JSON string often arrives in the PHP program in the $_get or $_post array. So I've shown you a hard-coded string be assigned here. But keep in mind it's probably coming from either a CGI variable or a file or a database. And it originated on the client when it sent it to the server. This is how it arrives at the server. This open curly brace is the start of the JSON format string. The closed curly brace is the end of the JSON format string. The JSON string format is simple. An open curly brace is the start of the object, and the closed curly brace marks the end of the object. Inside the curly brace, a simple list of variable : value pairs. See how they're comma separated? There's a variable and a value, comma, there's another variable and a value, comma, there's another variable and a value. Due to a quirk in JavaScript, the variable must be in quotes, but the value only requires the quotes for the string, not for numbers. Notice how the variable names are in quotes, but the values don't have to be in quotes. Let's watch the variable object on the next slide. Here's our object variable. This is a PHP object. Let's watch it closely on the next slide. $object equals JSON_decode and pass it our JSON format string. We are converting from the JSON string to a PHP object. Bang! The JSON decode function takes a JSON format string as input and returns a PHP object. Note the variables and values in the string are part of the object. That is it. Easy peasy. Now that the JSON string is an object, access, change, and output from that object is like any other PHP object. Follow this arrow. The data in this string was loaded into a PHP object over here. The variable names match and the values match. Echo $object arrow game dot cost this amount dot $object price. This is a simple print to verify that $object contains the variables and values from the JSON format string. At this point, it's like using any other object in PHP. The data is coming from the object and going through the echo out to the screen. Halo 3 costs $39. $object arrow game equals Halo 4. Let's do a simple upsell. Often an e-commerce website will try to get a customer to buy a more expensive product. In this case, reply to the client, see if the customer will upgrade to Halo 4. Everyone is always trying to upsell you. The client told the server they were interested in a $39 game. Let's try and sell them a $50 game. $object arrow ID equals 54321. Use $object to change to the ID of the more expensive game. All we're doing here is updating the object while it's in computer memory. Notice how we've got a new title of the game and we have a new ID of the game. $object price equals $49.99. Here's why we're doing it. It's $11 more. Use $object to change the price to the more expensive game. Upselling is just an example. I had to have some reason for changing this object, so I decided upselling would be my example. It's just an excuse to change $object. The customer expressed interest in a $39 game. Why not try selling them a $50 game? $new JSON string equals JSON underscore encode $object. Let's convert the PHP object back to a JSON format string. Bang! The JSON encode function takes a PHP object as input and returns a JSON format string. JSON is a data interchange format. Convert it to a string so the new data can be sent back to the client. Maybe. A JavaScript object is not compatible with a PHP object, but a string in JavaScript is compatible to a PHP string as long as they agree to the same format, and that's the JSON format string. I'm not directly sending an object back to the client. I'm sending a string in object format. Echo $new JSON string. At this point, echo the new JSON format string. Some JSON PHP programs return JSON to the client, not HTML. You can see the changes made to the object are reflected into the new JSON format string. Follow this arrow and you'll see it used to be Halo 3. We've upgraded it to Halo 4. The ID number has changed and the price has changed. This is the data we may send back to the client. There's another way you can use JSON in PHP. If you prefer associative arrays, I've changed the code to use them. If you add a true parameter to JSON decode, it returns an associative array and not an object. Now you can access / change the data using the bracket key end of bracket array syntax. Other than that, the code and the results are the same. By adding this true parameter to JSON decode, I have now loaded the data into an associative array, and I can use the array syntax for accessing the game and the price and changing the game ID and price down here. If you prefer this syntax, feel free to use it. Just because I changed over to associative array, everything else stays the same. I'm still updating the variable exactly like I did before, and I will still output the same data exactly as I did before. It's the programmer's preference. Do you want your JSON data in an array, or do you want it in an object? PHP is changing. The old model of a PHP program returning the entire page in HTML for display is evolving to a targeted approach. The new model is PHP returns a small section of web page and JavaScript dynamically inserts the small section of HTML on the page. Sometimes the PHP returns a JSON string and the JavaScript creates the HTML on the client. For most of this class, the PHP program has been returning HTML back to the client. Now with JSON, we can also return JSON format strings to the client and let the client display the data. PHP, JSON, and AJAX. AJAX stands for Asynchronous, JavaScript, and XML. Asynchronous allows JavaScript on the client to request HTML or JSON format from a server PHP program and not wait for a reply before displaying the page. Synchronous means I call the server and I wait for all the data to be sent back. Asynchronous means I can call the server, go off and do other things, and when the data arrives, it arrives. That's when I'll display it. This is not a JavaScript class, but if you're serious about web programming, go learn JavaScript. It's usually JavaScript on the client or browser side and PHP on the server side. And to really understand web programming, you got to know both sides. The X in AJAX is XML, but JSON has mostly replaced XML, but changing the name to AJAX seemed kind of silly. So even though originally AJAX sent XML back and forth between the client and server, today it more often sends JSON back and forth. But AJAX just didn't have quite the same pizzazz. AJAX is the technology that allows JavaScript and PHP to exchange data between the client and the server, dynamically updating the page without reloading the entire page. The old model is send me the entire page and I'll display it. The new model is send me a small piece of the page and I'll just update that part of the page. PHP, JSON, and AJAX. Websites like Discord or Twitch set up web pages to live stream real-time video game tournaments. Obviously, scoring updates every few seconds are critical. This is a perfect use for AJAX. Rather than update the entire page, AJAX asks the server for a score update. The PHP replies with an AJAX string, and then JavaScript dynamically updates just the score on the screen. Doesn't have to refresh the entire page, it just updates a little part of it that has the score on it. We are not going to cover JavaScript, but you need to understand it's the client that creates the JSON format string and sends it to the PHP program on the server, which converts the string to a PHP object, processing the data, then returns a JSON format string back to the client for display. Over here on the right, it's the client that prepares a JSON format string on the browser. It sends it off to the server in a request to run a PHP program. The PHP program gets that JSON string, builds an object out of it, processes the data, and now is going to send back a JSON format string to the browser, and it'll let the browser display the data that was sent back. Header, content type, application/JSON. We are going to send back to the browser a JSON format string. We don't normally issue a header because the automatic or default is HTML, and 99% of the time, PHP programs return HTML. The one time we called header, we were sending back images, and we had to tell the browser expect an image in reply to this PHP program. Now we're telling the client this PHP program will return a JSON format string, not HTML, not an image. A JSON string the client can display or, frankly, do whatever it wants with the JSON format string. JSON string equals $_get with a JSON key, or JSON string equals, and we'll show you the JSON format string here. Take a JSON input string from the client and assign it to $JSON_str. The input most likely came from a CGI $_get or $_post, but the second line shows you what the JSON input string looks like. The client is asking the server for game ID number 123 and the top 3 scores from that specific tournament. It's just a little easier to explain the example if we could see what's in the JSON input. $in object equals JSON_decode $JSON_str. Bang! The JSON decode function takes a JSON format string as input and returns a PHP object. Note the variables and the values in the string are part of $in object. That's it, easy peasy. My data on the input is converted to a PHP object, and you can see the variable names and the values match. Now that the JSON string is an object, we can access, change, and output from $in object like any other PHP object. $return obj equals get results $in object. Boom! Get results, which I didn't show you here, is simple. It uses the game ID 123 from $in object to run a select query on a MySQL database to extract the high scores from this tournament. It then uses the results 3 to create and return a PHP object with the 3 highest scores. Look at $return obj. Here's $return obj. Player 1 Rambo has a current score of 4359. That's the leader of the tournament at this moment in time. Player 2 is J Bond. Player 3 is Bambi. These are the 3 players in the tournament that have the highest scores at this point in time. $JSON RET_str equals JSON encode $return object. And then, for good measure, I showed you exactly what's going to be assigned to $JSON RET_str. Bang! The JSON encode function takes a PHP object as input and returns a JSON format string. Note the variables/values in the string are from $return object. The second line in this example shows what the JSON RET_str contains. Note the header at the top of the code. This PHP program has declared it will return a JSON format string to the browser, and now we have one. See up here, I said I will return you a JSON string, and we now have a JSON string suitable for return to the browser. Echo JSON return string. Send it back to the caller. Where does the echo go? It may not go straight to the browser. With AJAX, it is sent to the JavaScript, which then takes the JSON format string and builds their JavaScript object. From there, it may build and dynamically display an HTML table. When it does, it only needs to update the scores part of the screen, not the entire page. Follow the arrow. JSON return string goes to the output of the PHP program. Well, this PHP program has declared it will output a JSON string, and that JSON string gets sent right back to the client. What does the client do with it? Usually, it displays it on the screen. It'll take that JSON string, build a JavaScript object, and output HTML to a specific part of the screen. With AJAX, JavaScript on the client side sends a JSON format string to a PHP program on the server. It does the PHP magic and returns a JSON format string to the JavaScript on the client side. At that point, the JavaScript usually dynamically updates part of the web page without reloading the whole page. This is actually helpful to PHP programs. No longer does the PHP have to worry about formatting the output. It'll send it back to JavaScript and let it format the output. Whew, man, not only does that end this slide, I believe this is the last video I have to make for this course. I can now exit the Twilight Zone and return to my normal life. Thank you very much for watching these videos and doing your lessons. I enjoyed this course. I hope you enjoy it too. I'm going to move on and maybe do a Python course next. Thank you and good night. What should you do now? Well, if you haven't learned JavaScript yet and you want to be a web programmer, I highly recommend you learn JavaScript next.